Welcome. Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to talk to you guys about seeds starting today. If we want to get started, if you guys want to drop in the chat, if you consider yourself a beginner or aspiring gardener and farmer, or if you're experienced and just kind of seeing if you can catch some more tips, and then also what you're most excited about growing this year. I think particularly right now when it's getting warmer and sunnier, I think we're all thinking about what we're going to be growing this season. So I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say, and then we'll get rolling. And then while you guys are adding those into the chat, I just want to say that MSU is an affirmative action, equal opportunity employer. Michigan State University Extension programs and materials are open to all without regard to race, color, national origin, sex, gender, gender identity, religion, age, height, weight, disability, political beliefs, sexual orientation, marital status, family status, or veteran status. So all are welcome. And then I'm going to give a little shameless plug for Michigan State's Tollgate Farm and Education Center. So if you guys have never been out to the site, we are just out in Novi, across from the 12 Oak Mall. And it's kind of a hidden gem that we're trying to make not so hidden. So the site is 160 acres of protected farmland that hosts lots of walking trails through our woods and our fields. We have animals on site, beautiful gardens upkept by volunteers, and then we offer field trips, summer camps, education-focused events. We host weddings and parties. And then specifically for my purposes, we host a sustainable agriculture program. And so I am one of the co-managers of the Sustainable Agriculture Program. And what that entitles or involves is kind of three different aspects. So we have about 4.5 acres of diversified vegetables that we maintain and grow on site. Those vegetables are then distributed through that second aspect, which is our CSA, or community supported agriculture. So if you're not familiar with that concept, it's the idea of members buy in at the beginning of the season and they come out to the farm every week during the season and pick up vegetables. And the third component of our program and why we have the operation and why we have the CSA is that we host a beginner farmer training program. So apprentices spend about 6 months with us on the farm and are able to kind of get a hands-on intensive introduction into sustainable agriculture in terms of working and managing a small scale vegetable operation. So let's look at the chat. Potatoes, lots of beginners. Awesome. Happy to have you. Very cool. All right. Awesome. So let's see. Here we go. So we'll go ahead and get started. And so we'll kind of do just a overview of why is it valuable to start your own seeds. Obviously, you can get started seeds from kind of anywhere, starting in the spring, but why might it be an option and a valuable option to start them with your house? And so one of the reasons is that it's kind of the more economical way to fill your garden. So there might be, particularly in your first season, some upfront costs in terms of containers or lighting or anything like that. But in the long run, it's a more economical way to fill your garden because you are spending less for just a packet of seeds and some soil than you would be going to your, Lowe's or Home Depot and purchasing starts from them. It also allows you to take a jump start on the season. So instead of waiting to start seeds out in your garden when it's a little bit nicer, you can start seeds indoors. And as soon as that weather changes and you're kind of past that last frost date of the season, those plants can then go right out into your garden. This is particularly helpful for any long season crops or very weather dependent crops such as tomatoes or peppers that really need warm temperatures to thrive. And in Michigan, you kind of only get a little bit of window to do that. You also have complete control over the transplant quality and varieties. So you can very much add all of the inputs that you're adding in are going to be what you want. So you can pick what kind of soil mix that you want. You can pick what kind of seeds you want, and really curate your garden to be exactly what you want to get out of it. And then also goes towards access to varieties that may be hard to find. So if you know that you like this very specific type of heirloom tomato, it might be easier for you to start that tomato by seed, so you have exactly the quantity and the variety that you want for that season. Sorry, there's a little bit of a lag with my screen or my slides changing. Come on. Oop, there we go. Not sure why it's such a delay. But so before we get kind of a little bit deeper into seed starting, we're going to talk about the difference between direct seeding and transplanting. So when I say direct seeding, I'm referring to planting those seeds directly outside into the soil. And so that, as we've already talked about, is kind of very dependent on temperature and conditions. So depending on that type of seed, you might have to wait until it gets a little bit warmer to put those in the ground, which then delays when that plant is going to reach its full maturity and start, yielding a crop off of it. It's also not ideal for all plants. So depending on kind of the specific plant or the type of seed or anything like that, some plants just don't really take well to it. So crops that are very commonly direct seeded would be if you're doing like a dense like lettuce mix or arugula or spinach, quick rooting crops like turnips or radishes and beets, anything with a long tap root. So carrots, kind of your storage radishes that have a longer tap root, anything that's root specific that you're harvesting it for the roots, those are going to be less ideal to transplant and better to direct seed into the ground. And this picture here is one of our apprentices from last year using our push seeder, pushing those directly into the ground. And then transplanting is obviously what we're going to be talking about specifically today, which would be starting your seeds indoors and then planting them outside when they are big enough. And again, similarly, it's not ideal for all plants. So you're going to kind of pick crops that are well suited to being transplanted. And so usually that's kind of your tomatoes and your peppers, things that need a head start in the season because they're such a long crop, and also would not do well if you just stuck a tomato seed out in the ground. It's not to say that it would not work, but it's just not the ideal conditions for it. All right, so your seed starting basics. So we're going to go over 5 kind of basic concepts today. And so we're going to talk about seeds, containers, lighting, temperature, and your growing medium. So seeds. Quality matters, age matters, and storage matters. And those are kind of your biggest things that you want to think about when you're thinking about seeds. So when I'm talking about quality, first and foremost, I'm talking about the quality of the seeds that you're purchasing. So you want to make sure that you're buying from a reliable seed company. It's also ideal if you grow organically to buy organic seeds because that's how they were grown, and they are going to have micro adjustments to those seeds that are better adapted to organic management versus conventional management. So if that is the way that you want to grow, then it's better to look for seeds that are also grown organically so they're used to that system. It's also kind of worth your time to research crops and varieties that are well suited to the Michigan climate. So, we can grow onions in Michigan, but we tend to go with shorter day onions and not long day onions because we just don't have the amount of growing days in our season to do a long day onion. So it's worth doing the research about what varieties and what types grow well here and are going to set yourself up for success. And you can also do that by buying from seed companies that are local. So we have 2 in the area, Ann Arbor Seed Company and Nature and Nurture, that are out in like the Ann Arbor Dexter area. And those are companies that are growing seeds in our climate that then are going to be better suited for growing in this climate. So that is something that you can consider when you're thinking about growing seeds, is buying from these local companies. Obviously, you're supporting local, which is very important, but you're also going to have potentially a better outcome with those seeds because they've grown in this area. Age matters. So that is in regards to that seeds have a certain amount of time that their germination is viable for, or seed companies will let you know that, hey, your first year out, you can get 95% germination rate, which is pretty good. Depending on the type of seed, that germination rate goes down. And so there are charts online that you can see what those germination rates are. So for something like kale, you get about 5 years of good germination rates before those numbers start kind of really declining, and you're going to see really poor germination rates. There are crops such as onions and corn that you are given 1 year that they recommend you to use those, and that you do not use those again. And again, this doesn't mean that you can't. It just means that you want to be more aware that you could get lower yields off of those plants. So what you could do is you could run a germination test. And so I have it on there. So running a germination test is you just take a specific number of seeds. And so anywhere from maybe 3 to 10, you want to have more than 2, but you don't want a lot. So kind of 3 to 10 is a good amount. You're going to put them in a moistened paper towel in a plastic bag. And usually we seal it up just almost all the way. So this still has a little bit of air movement, and leave that in a warm place. Check regularly. If that paper towel starts to dry off, you can spray it a couple times with water. And then once those seeds start to germinate, you can see how many of them have come up, and that'll give you a more accurate picture of what your new germination rate is. So you could have that first year, you're getting 95% germination rate off your kale, which is pretty normal. And then that second year, maybe you're getting a little bit less, you're down to maybe 85. And those will just inform you about how densely you need to plant something, if you need to plant a little bit extra because you know you're going to lose some. But it's always something to keep in mind of the company's rates that they recommend, and also that you can check it on your own to see about those germination rates. The last thing to keep in mind is your storage of those seeds. So you might buy extra, and you have extra seed at the end of the year. You don't use it all. You want to keep it for the next year. The storage of those seeds can really not only help germination rates that following year, but also save you a lot of money, because there's no point in throwing those seeds away if they are going to be still usable the following year. So in terms of storage, you want to find a cool, dark place to keep them that keeps a pretty consistent temperature. So like the back of a closet, a cabinet, something like that is a great place to keep them that is going to hold that steady temperature. The other consideration that you want to have is that there's not going to be any moisture getting into these seeds, because obviously moisture would make those seeds then germinate. So putting them kind of in a plastic bag can work really well. Something, an airtight tote, anything like that. So we save a lot of seed from year to year because it's cheaper to buy in bulk. So what we do is we keep ours in our walk-in cooler. They are in bags that have the little moisture packets that you can kind of like get in shoes and all of that. And then it's in an airtight tote. And we have had really good success with keeping our seeds that way. Your growing medium. And when I say growing medium, just a fancy term for soil. So again, quality matters. So when you're looking at your, all the options at the store, you want to find something that's specifically for seed starting. because it's going to have all of the components specifically mixed and formulated for seed starting. So it's not to say that different mixes don't work, but if you have the option to buy specific seed starting, that is the way to go. And then again, storage matters. And this would refer to both the storage at the store that you buy it from and the storage at your house. So I don't know if you guys have walked into, Home Depot or Lowe's and you're trying to get a bag of soil, and sometimes they have it outside and sometimes it's inside. The ones outside this time of year are often quite frozen or really heavy. And that means that moisture has gone into them. And what the problem is with that is that not only is the moisture in there potentially harboring pathogens and diseases that can then be transmitted to your plants, but also if there's water running through it, more likely than not, some of those nutrients that were specifically put into your soil mix for the better health of those seeds have now leached out. So now instead of having to fertilize 4 weeks after your planting date, you might have to fertilize a little bit sooner. So if you're able to find mix that is still light, fluffy, clearly has never been, wet or frozen, that is the way to go. So yeah, I would look for stuff that is stored inside. And then when you get it to your house, again, putting it in the garage or in a tote on your porch or something like that, where it's not going to get wet is the ideal place to store your growing medium. And I just kind of alluded to it, but most pre-mixed seed starters will tell you how long they estimate you can go before fertilizing. So I know that the one that we use, you can go 4 weeks from the time that your plant has started to germinate before they recommend that you add in supplemental fertilizers, because that plant has now more than likely used up all of the nutrients and fertilizer that is in that potting mix. So that's always something to keep in mind if you have a plant that's going to be living in your pot for more than that allotted time, is you might want to supplement with a little extra nutrients to get it to its full potential. And when we're kind of talking about growing medium, most have kind of 4 or 5 different components that make up the seed starting medium. So you're going to be perlite, which are those little white pieces. And that helps improve aeration and helps with drainage. So it's a very essential part of that mix so that it doesn't get too compacted, that then the roots have trouble pushing through. You're going to have peat or a peat-like substance. I will let you do your own research. There's a lot of controversy in the growing world right now, whether we should be using peat. So you can find peat alternatives in seed starting mixes these days, but that peat or peat-like substance improves aeration and retains soil moisture. And they also often have some degree of compost. And so that compost makes up the bulk of your seed starting mix, and it adds like a slow release of nutrients and helps retain that moisture as well. And then they usually have some amount of minerals and fertilizers that are helping provide essential nutrients as that plant gets started. Containers. So I want to stress that seed starting doesn't not need to be expensive. As you can see on the right side, these are just berry containers that are then in the kind of disposable baking dishes. So any container that has drainage, from yogurt containers to berry containers to egg cartons, anything like that can be used as a seed starting vessel. You can, if you want to go the route of purchasing specific things, they have biodegradable options that are usually on the more expensive side, but you can trade that off with the ability of just then sticking that whole pot into the ground, which is very nice. There are also the option of kind of getting the traditional commercial seed trays, which are, again, an upfront investment, but that's something that you can hang on to for multiple years. So I think we have some seed trays that are probably going on 6 or 7 years. And we're a commercial operation, so they definitely get used and abused sometimes, and they really hold up. So if, seed starting is something you really want to get into, that is something that you can do to kind of up your game a little bit. The nice thing about the seed trays is they do take up a lot less space because they are made for commercial operations. So they're kind of created with as little wasted space as possible, which is also nice in the home setting as well. Domes can be really nice. So you can buy domes that will just kind of fit over your container. And when I'm saying dome, kind of refers to a plastic covering that will retain that moisture and humidity. And so kind of these berry containers have a natural built-in dome, which is really nice. But you can also buy them to fit over your seed trays. You do want to make sure, and I bolded this because my mom made this mistake last year, as soon as your seeds start to germinate, you want to make sure that you're removing that dome because there's just a lack of airflow. It can inhibit the sunlight coming in. So that is something you want to remove as soon as the seeds start to germinate, but it pretty much creates just a mini greenhouse in your house. The last thing is don't forget to label. And I really stress this because we've had years where our labeling game was not very strong. And then, 3, 4, 5 weeks down the road, you really don't know what variety you're working with. You can know like, oh, this is a tomato, but it is very important to know what kind of tomato this is. And we always add variety and also the date that we seeded it. Because that can also be very important when you are thinking of, is this plant performing well? Is it at the growth stage that it should be? If you plant something and then 3 weeks later, it still hasn't emerged from the soil, and it's not a plant that takes 3 weeks, then you probably have some kind of issue going on in your soil or something wrong with your seeds. Or it can go the opposite way of something like, and this is not necessarily a great example for seed starting because you wouldn't start carrots indoors. But if you are out in your garden and you started carrots and they can take up to 3 weeks to germinate and you're at maybe week 1, there could be, the fear, the voice in the back of your head saying, oh, why isn't this germinating? What happened? But in reality, if you know what date you planted it, you'll just know that, oh, it has at least 2 more weeks that I can wait and it has time to germinate. So those are things to consider. And then on the topic of containers, there's also kind of an ideal size to work with when you're talking about pots and plugs. So not only can the right size pot or plug save space and save materials, which again, in both the commercial and in the home setting are very good things to keep, to have in mind. But too much soil can actually cause disease issues. So if you're trying to germinate a little tomato inside a giant pot, that can actually have potentially negative effects on that tomato's ability to grow and thrive because that soil is going to be holding on to more moisture than that plant can use. And if we're particularly in a time like this where it's overcast, it's still pretty chilly, you might not be getting enough evaporation off of that soil. That wetness is just going to harbor pathogens that can then negatively affect your plant. So when you're deciding what size pot to use, obviously the first and foremost is what size pot do you have? So if you have all the same pots, then that's fine. And that's what you have to work with. If you have different size pots, then maybe you use your smaller pots for your kale and other kind of smaller seeded crops. And maybe you keep some of your little bit larger ones for your squashes or something that's going to be moving in and out and takes up a lot of space. A general rule of thumb is that the larger the seed, the larger the pot that it needs and that you can use. So an example of that would be squash. Summer squash, cucumbers, pumpkins, all of those have pretty big seeds and also can use a lot of that soil very quickly. So they are very fast growing crops. You put those in, they're in and out of the greenhouse in 3 weeks, and they have filled that entire plug in those 3 weeks. So the bigger the seed, the bigger the pot that you can use. And then this one at the bottom, sometimes the longer the plant is in the pot, the bigger the pot it requires. And I'm going to say sometimes again, because that's not always the case. So an example of that is onions, which is something that stays in the greenhouse for a very long amount of time because it's a very slow growing plant. But you actually don't need to put it in a very big pot because it's, regardless of how long it's been in the greenhouse, it's just not taking up that much space. So this is one of those rules of it works, but not always works. It's kind of dependent on the specific crop and kind of what your intention is and how fast you think you're going to get it out of your house. Lighting. So supplemental lighting can be very helpful. It's not always necessary. I think if you go on sites that sell supplemental lighting, they tell you that you have to have it. And I think there are cases that it can be extremely beneficial. So you should consider using supplemental lighting if you don't have access to a south-facing window. So in reality, you do need a window that gets sunlight most of the day to have enough sunlight for your crops to be growing sufficiently. And so if your plants currently look or have looked in the past really leggy, so like kind of strung out, really skinny, they're having trouble kind of really putting on growth, that means that they are not having enough access to sunlight. And if that is the case, then it would be time to invest in supplemental lighting. And the nice thing about supplemental lighting is if you decide to go that route, then that means that you can be putting those seeds, they don't have to be next to a window because you're adding that light. So you could put them in a back bedroom that doesn't get a lot of light. You could put them in your basement or a shed, something like that, it kind of opens you up to where you can put them because you're not relying on the sunlight. And ideally, those lights should be on for 14 hours a day. Depends on the crop, but kind of in Michigan and most of the stuff that we grow here, 14 hours is usually pretty sufficient. And it's beneficial to put them on a timer because then you don't have to worry about, oh, did I turn it off? Did I turn it on? So you can just put it on a greenhouse or a Christmas tree timer or anything like that to make sure that you're getting the daylight that you need. And then most lights, they kind of depends on the light that you're using, but the general rule of thumb is 3 to 6 inches from the top of the plant. So they really are quite close to it. And there are lots of different lights out there. And it really depends on what you're growing, what you're willing to spend on lights, all of that. So you can get anywhere from these kind of just fluorescent lights that you can string up on one of these racks. Sometimes you can get light bulbs that just screw into existing lights. So there's lots of options in terms of the color of light and the strength of the light and all of that. Temperature. So requirements vary from variety to variety. So you want to check that usually it's on the back of the seed packet or easily accessible on most seed companies' websites about what they recommend in terms of the ideal seed or soil temperature for that seed. So you can regulate that temperature. Most commonly, it's done by heat mats. So you can see on the right, this is a heat mat that we currently have going in our greenhouse for germinating our peppers. So peppers prefer soil temperatures of 75 to 85 degrees, which is much warmer than our greenhouse is consistently right now, because it would be extremely expensive to heat our greenhouse to that temperature. So an less expensive way of regulating that temperature would be to have this heat mat that is directly heating the soil. And I've circled in red the probe. So this one came with a probe that goes into your soil, and then it takes that reading onto our little, I don't know what that's called actually, our little reader. And so if we get up, so ours is set to 80 degrees. So if the soil temperature is 80, then the heat mat shuts off and will cycle back on to keep that consistent temperature. And it has proved to really do wonders for our germination this time of year when the greenhouse is a little bit colder and we can't really rely on the greenhouse being 75 to 85 degrees. What's nice about these two is that you can then take down the temperature. So for something, again, like peppers, where you want 75 to 85 degrees to germinate, once those actually germinate, you don't want your soil temperature to be that high, because as the roots form and fill up those trays, that high of a temperature can actually burn the plants. So it's a nice way to then dial that down. So we'll probably take it down to about 70 degrees. So it's still warmer, but it doesn't have the potential of burning those roots. And if you go the route of having supplemental light, most light sources, regardless of what kind of lights they are going to provide some kind of heat. So depending again on what crop that you're growing, sometimes that can be a sufficient amount of heat that is being generated. And going back to those domes that you can put over your crops, the domes are going to do the moisture and the humidity, and they're also going to add a fair amount of heat to get your plants germinated. So we've gone over kind of the 5 basic things that you want to consider for your seed starting setup operation. So now we'll kind of talk about actually starting your seeds and kind of walk through some of the processes that you'll want to consider as you start seeding. So the number 1 would be deciding when to start your seeds. And this can be a daunting task because seeding dates vary so much depending on where you are, depending on the seeds, depending on when you actually want to harvest. So it can be a lot of juggling of numbers and decision making and all of that. So there are a couple of really easy things to keep in mind when you are kind of setting your seeding schedule. And so one would be to check the back of your seed packet. Often they will tell you, start inside 8 weeks before the last frost. And so that's letting you know that you can start it 8 weeks before the last frost and then immediately plant it out. So that's always a helpful way of knowing that this is not a frost tolerant plant, but as soon as that is passed, you can put it in the ground, and it's saying that, it takes about 8 weeks to be fully mature for you to be able to put it in the ground. So those are a nice way to kind of calculate how far out you can go. Those really are helpful for kind of for crops that are going to be in the ground for the entire season. So something like a tomato. It's less helpful if you're trying to stagger crops. So if you're trying to grow something like head lettuce and you're trying to do a consistent amount of head lettuce, that recommendation can be less helpful because okay, well, I can start my head lettuce 4 weeks before the last frost, but if I want to have a continual harvest, like when do I do that? So that's when I would recommend using a seed starting calculator. And I particularly like the one that Johnny's Seeds has on their website. And in general, they have a very robust and helpful seed starting section and lots of articles on their website. But their seed starting calculator is very nice because you can add in your average frost-free date and then scroll through, and they will tell you when you should be planting each of your crops. And they also give recommendations on if you're trying to do a continual harvest, then they will tell you, so you'll start your first one 3 weeks before the last frost, you'll start your next one 1 week before the last frost, and they'll tell you exactly when you're supposed to be starting your seeds, which can be very helpful. And then on the realm of average frost-free date, April 23rd to May 4th is kind of the general average for our area in Southeast Michigan. So we usually go off of after Memorial Day is usually extremely safe. And then there's always, you either have a bit of poor planning or you get overexcited or something like that, and you accidentally start your seeds too soon. And that doesn't mean that, those seeds are necessarily a waste or that they're not going to perform very well. And there are things that you can do to help those seeds along. So one of them would be to pot them up, and we're going to talk about this more later in the presentation. but you can put them into another pot to buy you more time. So it'll give that plant more opportunity to grow out, more nutrients, and it kind of just buy you a little bit more time. And you can also put them outside, which slows their growth. It also helps reduce transplant shock down the road. And so sometimes if we know we're not going to get to something, we will put it outside a little bit earlier than we normally would, just to slow that growth down. Calculating your seeding rate. And I don't know if any of you expected to have to do any math while you were here, but unfortunately I have learned that you have to do a lot of math as a gardener and farmer. And so I wanted to share with you guys kind of the really quick and dirty seed calculation that you guys can use. Sorry, Leo wants to be involved in the conversation. So what you can do is when you're planning out your garden, you can think of how many plants do you want? So we'll go with, we want 5 tomato plants in the garden. And then we always factor in a fudge factor. And so that's just kind of taking into account that you want 5 plants, but if you only put 5 seeds in your pot or in your pots, then that's taking a risk. And it's always better to assume that some are not going to germinate. So we usually use a fudge factor. So it's a factoring in percentage of an overage. And we usually use about 3 to 5% extra. And there's sometimes that we have really great germination and we end up having a lot of extra. There's also been times that for some reason or another, whether it's just poor germination or we have some kind of disease, that we end up using that entire extra 5% that we seeded. And we would have been out a lot of seedlings if we hadn't done that. So we always kind of factor in that little bit of an overage. And you're also going to want to multiply that by the amount of seeds per plug. And it's in a similar vein to that fudge factor, is that you want to overseed each pot by a predetermined amount. And then you would go back and thin them down to how many you actually want in the pot. So an example would be, a tomato, you can put 2 tomato seeds in the pot. If both of them come up, then you would thin one down. More often than not, one of them will grow more vigorously than the other. So the decision's pretty easy. But again, it then saves you from now, if you only put 1 seed in and that seed doesn't germinate, then you have a pot that you have wasted that soil because nothing came up out of it. And it just gives you a little bit more room for anything that might happen. And so that's factoring in the number of plants wanted with that fudge factor and your seeds per plug. That's going to give you the number of seeds that you need for that specific variety. That can help you then order seeds and then plant those seeds to the correct amount that you want. So seeding. So kind of the general setup that we use, it's about, I have 8 steps on here. So the first one is kind of preparing your containers in your growing medium. So preparing, those containers would mean if they're containers that you've used in past years and you want to sanitize them, this is going to prevent any disease or pathogens or anything like that that is kind of harboring in any little crevices that you may have. It kind of gets those out of the way and starts you fresh for the new season. And then your growing medium, some people prefer to pre-wet that medium so that it's then easier to make sure that your soil is wet all the way through. So if you want to pre-wet that medium, this would be the time to do it. The next step will be filling the pots with the seed starting mix. And then we use the kind of the strategy of then tapping the trays on the table to settle that soil. You don't want compact soil. So you don't want to be pushing down with your fingers or with, anything like that. So there's no air in your pot or your plug, but you do want to make sure that there aren't any huge air gaps that are wasting space and potentially that your plant's going to encounter and your seed might fall into that and all of that. So you kind of tap it down, make sure that it's completely settled, and then you can add more soil if needed to kind of get you all the way to the top. The next step would be to create a slight indent, or the technical term is dibble. So that slight indent is just going to give you a little bit of space for you to then set that seed in, so you know exactly the depth you're putting it at and exactly, you know, the center of your pot that it's going in. I just lost my train of thought. I apologize. Oh, sorry. Oh, there we go. The general rule of thumb is that the bigger the seed, the deeper it can go. So a big squash seed, you can push down pretty far into the ground or into your soil mix. Something like a kale or a lettuce seed that's quite small, you really only want a very slight indent where that seed is going to go. Just always keeping in mind that that seed has to emerge all the way out of that soil, and the seed only has enough energy to get it to the top. And so if it's pushed down too far, then that seed is going to run out of energy, and it could potentially die in the soil. So you want it deep enough that you can't see the seed at the top, but that it's, you know, getting a lot of good seed to soil contact. Again, then you'll put the kind of the covering of a light soil over top. You're going to label that container with what crop it is, what variety is, and what date it is. So you know exactly what you're planting and when you planted it. Gently water the seeds in. You want to be very careful those first couple of times that you don't water too big of water droplets or too aggressively, because that can then dislodge the seed from where it is in your soil and even like make it run off into the ground. And then always think about your germination timeline and how it depends on the type of plant. So onions can take up to 2 weeks to germinate. Squash, depending on what temperature is, can be up in 2 days. So knowing those germination rates is always very helpful and very nice, and decreases stress because you're not wondering why something is taking so long to germinate. Watering, so too much water is just as bad as too little. So this is something that is very easy to do poorly, and is something that you should really think about very proactively as you are watering. So there's two types of watering. So we have bottom watering and overhead. On the right is overhead. So, you know, using a hose with a sprinkler attachment or a watering can to just gently water over top, or bottom watering where you're putting your pots in a container that does not have any holes, and letting that pot soak up from the bottom. And I think the bottom watering is very popular in the home setting because there's less risk of kind of mess going everywhere because the water is going directly into that pan. And when you're watering, you want to make sure that your soil is always moist, so that your seed has all the ability to uptake as much moisture as it needs, but that it's not too damp or too dry, because both of those can really have negative effects on that plant's success and ability to thrive. And a rule of thumb is the larger and more mature the plant, the more that you want to water it. So tiny little seedlings aren't uptaking that much. You want to make sure that it's very moist for them, but they don't need, you know, lots and lots of water each day. You most likely would just kind of have to top them off if the top has started to dry off. But as that plant gets bigger and, you know, starts putting on more and more leaves, it's using much more energy and using much more water while it's growing. Hardening off. So once your plant has germinated, it has grown, it looks really good. Hardening off is the process of putting that plant outdoors so it can adjust before you plant it outside. So it's adjusting for temperature, wind, rain, particularly if it's in a house. It's going to have extremely consistent temperatures, no wind, no rain, obviously, you know, all that kind of stuff. And it can be a huge shock to plants and will actually set them back if they don't have this opportunity to acclimate to what the outdoors are. And so this can be done in two trains of thought. You can kind of do it gradually over a few days. You can put them out during the day, bring them back at night, put them up a few more hours each day, a very kind of slow acclimation. You can do what we do, is that we just put all of ours out at once. We pick a mild day and we leave them out there, and we really have had good success with that. It's a lot less moving things around and thinking about how long they've been outside. With both of these methods, you want to keep in mind the weather. So sometimes like a late frost can roll through, and you'll want to bring those crops inside, because they are not, even if they are pretty frost tolerant, in those tiny little plugs, they're not well suited to a big frost or a snowstorm or anything like that. And it's better to bring them back inside so they don't have to deal with that. Transplanting, so now you've hardened off a little bit and now it's time to actually transplant them. And the amount of time that seedlings spend inside before being transplanted out, as with everything, varies greatly. And so I feel like I've said this multiple times during this presentation, but a really good source of learning what the kind of recommended amount of time that your seedling stays inside would be to check that seed packet, because it'll give you variety specific information that they recommend. You also want to make sure that your plant has 3 to 4 sets of true leaves. And if we look at this kale plant on the right, you'll see that there's 2 different kinds of leaves on this plant. So the rounder ones are called cotyledons, and those are your first leaves that are going to emerge as the plant pokes through the soil. So those are not true leaves, those are cotyledons, and their purpose is just to perform the first couple of rounds of photosynthesis and collect energy so that the plant can then put out its true leaves, and true leaves look like the plant will eventually look like. So all brassicas all have kind of this very kind of cute round cotyledons, and then as they mature, they'll put on their very individual type of leaves. So you would want 3 to 4 sets of true leaves before you think about transplanting them out. You also make sure they have a very robust root system. So we do what we call kind of the tug test. So if I were to tug on this kale plant right now, it would, if I tug too hard, it would just snap, because the root system is not well developed in there and it's not holding on to anything. So you would either pull the entire plant out with the roots, or the top would snap off, but it wouldn't give you your desired effect, which is that the whole plug with all the soil comes out. So when that plant is ready to go outside and go into the soil, those roots will have fully encased whatever plug size that you are in. Obviously, it's a kind of a balance of not letting it go going too long and becoming root bound, but you do want the roots to fully form within that plug cell. And then the outside temperature needs to be above a certain degree for many plants. No sign of frost. Again, very dependent on what you're growing. So this would be pretty specific to kind of your warmer weather crops, tomatoes, peppers, summer squash, where for them to really thrive, the temperature needs to be consistently over 75 degrees, or over, I think it's over 75 for most of its life. So even you can put them out if there's no frost on the horizon, you can put them out. It's not going to necessarily kill the plant, but it's just not beneficial. So sometimes it's easier to keep them inside, and you're going to wait until those ideal temperatures are on the horizon. So I'm going to wrap up quickly with some frequently asked questions about seed starting. So the first one is, what does potting up mean? And we've already chatted about it a little bit. So potting up or bumping up refers to the process of moving a plant to a larger container to prevent them from being root bound and provide more nutrients. So you can pot up plants for 2 reasons, and maybe more, but 2 main reasons. So you can do it intentionally to build bigger and stronger root systems. So we pot up peppers, tomatoes, eggplants. You can see on the far right, we start them in these 20 rows. Once they put on a couple of leaves, we then pot them up into these blocks, and that's where they'll spend the rest of their lives. So we do them with our kind of high value long season crops like peppers, tomatoes, eggplants, and it just gives them the ability to really build a robust root system before they go out. These are also generally very expensive seeds. And so if you plant them in these 20 rows, you have the ability to put them on a heat mat. And so you get really good germination rates. You're able to kind of manipulate the amount of seed, like overage you have to seed, so that you are seeding as little extra as possible, which is very helpful. But there are farms that pot up everything, and there are farms that pot up nothing. So it's very much personal preference. The other strategy, which we've already talked about, is you can pot up plants as a time-saving strategy. If the weather isn't cooperating, if you planted too early, potting them up into a bigger pot just allows you to have more time, and that plant really isn't going to have any negative effects off of that. Another frequently asked question are, what are soil blocks? So soil blocks are a block made out of lightly compressed potting soil. The block serves as both the container and the growing medium. And as you saw in the last slide, we use soil blocks at Tollgate as part of our operation. Again, it's only for those really high value crops of peppers, tomatoes, and eggplants. But we pot up all of those into soil blocks. And the idea behind them is that they have the ability, because there's no plastic bounding them, that the roots will grow until they hit the air, and then they will air prune. And so then that root will just stop growing. Whereas in a traditional plastic pot, when those roots hit the plastic container, they start circling. And that's where the term root circling comes from, which can be can have negative effects on that plant's yields and that plant's health as it continues to grow. So we were able to start using soil blocking a couple of years ago. We were just trialing it, kind of collecting some data, because there's not a lot of scientific knowledge out there on yields and all of that. And we really liked it. And so we have kept it for those crops. And as you can see on the right, these are 2 tomatoes that were started at the exact same time, potted up on the same day. But the one in the soil block is much more vigorous. It has a thicker stalk, it's taller, has more leaves. So it is, as you can see, is the cons. It takes more time, because you're not just filling a pot with soil, you are mixing an actual mix of soil and water to a desired consistency. You have to then, put them in the blocker and punch them all out. So it does take a fair amount more time, but it can yield better and healthier crops. And also a different way of doing it, other than having kind of the puncher, is you can also make a seed ball, or if you've ever made a seed bomb, with wildflowers or anything like that. It's a similar concept of just wet soil that you then form into a ball, and then you can either pot up into that. People will will put direct seeded crops into it. So that's an option for a completely plastic containerless way of growing. And then the last frequently asked question is, what is damping off and how do I prevent it? So if you have been unfortunate enough to have this happen, it can be quite devastating. So damping off is a disease caused by different pathogens that kill or weaken seedlings before or as they germinate. So this is kind of very common, what it looks like. So just above the soil line, the pathogens have entered into that plant and have just destroyed the structure and has killed that plant. And there really is, if it's gotten this bad, there's no coming back for this plant. And it can also happen if that seed hasn't even emerged. So if you're really getting poor germination, it potentially is damping off is what is happening to your seeds. And so how can you prevent this? I think first and foremost, most years you're always going to have a little bit of damping off. It's unfortunately just pretty ubiquitous. That's why you overseed a little bit, so that you can kind of keep that into account. If you're using a pot for multiple seasons, disinfecting them before each season, you again want to make sure that you're not overwatering them, making sure that they just have enough moisture, they're not sopping wet. And then heat mats and supplemental lights can be very beneficial because they are helping with evaporation of that water. They're keeping that soil temperature to that desired temperature. And they can be very beneficial in kind of staving off and dampening off. So we've kind of covered all of these things, and now it's time to kind of really make that seed starting plan. So the first step would be designing your garden. So what varieties, what amounts do you want? Creating that seeding and planting schedule. So when you're in the season, you don't have to think about it. You can be like, okay, today I'm doing this, tomorrow I'm doing that. And it can make it much easier and less daunting. Gathering your supplies, so your soil, your seeds, containers, your heat mat if you want to use one, and then set up that seed starting station. So that can be, you know, in a sunny window, that can be in your basement with a grow light, but making that setup as easy and user-friendly as possible. And then the last one is be patient and have fun. Seed starting is definitely a labor of love, and it can be incredibly rewarding. But it also it's a lot of work, and sometimes it doesn't work out, and it's always learning about what you can do better from year to year. I appreciate you all listening to me talk, and I hope you learned something from it. And I'm going to look at the chat and see if we have questions. All right, I missed the names of local seed sources. So the two local companies are Ann Arbor Seed Company and Nature and Nurture Seeds, both out of Ann Arbor and the Dexter area. Both have online catalogs that you can order from. Oh, that's a great question. Can you grow seeds harvested from your kitchen waste? Absolutely. Yeah, so what you'll want to do, and that I feel like is a whole nother presentation, but absolutely. So you can take those seeds, make sure they're nice and dry. I would do a germ test on them to make sure that they are viable. There are certain seeds that have been bred to be sterile. So that is something before you invest a lot of time into trying growing these, do a germ test to see if they actually do sprout. Then again, a whole nother conversation, but depending on the crop and how it was grown, sometimes that crop will not necessarily grow back exactly how it was. So if it's an open pollinated pepper, it might not have the same characteristics as that pepper, but it'll be a fun experiment. How do you keep squirrels from digging up seedlings when you've taken them outside to harden? That's a great question. So if you know that you have a squirrel problem, that would be one that I probably wouldn't leave them outside overnight until they're much bigger. And potentially if you can have some kind of protected area, they make something called row cover that we use out in our field. That you can just cover those crops. So they're still going to get kind of the temperature, and breezes can pass through them, but it acts as more of like a physical barrier from those plants. So I would recommend doing something like that. Winter sowing in plastic milk jugs in Michigan. I think it's awesome. We do a lot of it at the farm with the kids and have had pretty good success with it. I think it can work really well. The only issue that we've ever had is that sometimes it's just not quite sunny enough, and then they either get too wet inside the greenhouse, or the opposite, that we forget to water them, and they get too dry. But if you stay on top of it and you're really watching them, I think it can be a very effective way to start your seeds much earlier and start them outside much earlier. Homemade newspaper seed starting pots. We also do these with the kids on the farm and have had really good success with them. What's nice about them is that the newspaper is so thin that you really don't have to worry about your seeds potentially not being able to break through them, which is a problem with some types of decomposing pots or compostable pots. There we go. So those are really nice. The only downside of them is that if you have just like a very small window to get them out into your garden, so if you plant them too early by accident, that newspaper breaks down almost too quickly. And then you have the potential of kind of it being a bit messy and the seeds or the plant going everywhere. That would be my only critique on the pots, is that they can sometimes lose their integrity too quickly. Oh, I'm so sorry about the echo. What are the best seeds to use? So I think, and if you have a specific question or like specific kind, or if you're just asking like what seed companies, so I think the two local seed companies are really great. We also buy a lot of seeds off of, there's so many good companies. So we have, there's Johnny's Select Seeds, High Mowing. Those both have a lot of organic seed options. Fedco, Territorial. There's really so many good seed companies out there. So kind of an unlimited option there. But I really do like the local companies. They're a lot of fun. What is the best way to sow tiny seeds? Oh my gosh, I feel you there. We just were seeding some thyme seeds, and I don't know if anyone has seeded thyme before, but they are quite possibly the smallest seeds I've ever seen in my entire life. So our approach to those were that we used an open flat and we seeded them into the open flat. And then what we're going to do is we're going to pot them up once they germinate. Because the idea of taking all those tiny seeds and putting them into their own containers was just kind of mind-boggling. So tiny seeds can do well with kind of the potting up option. They do make a little seeder that you can kind of fill up a little hopper, and then it dispenses one seed at a time. I've had mixed results with those, but that's an option that you can try. What kinds of vegetables are the easiest one to grow for a complete beginner? Squash. So summer squash, cucumbers, pumpkins, those are all really easy. What's nice is the seed is really big. They germinate really quickly. And for the most part, they yield pretty well. And so that's a nice one to get. It's very gratifying harvest. Other things, kale's really another easy one to grow. One that's not necessarily something you would start indoors, but something that's really easy to grow just out in your garden would be, sorry, that's my cat feeder going off. Would be radishes or turnips, because again, they just germinate so quickly. So it's very easy to see where they are and if they have germinated. But I would go with something in the squash family for a first try. Yes, I agree. M.I. Gardner out of Port Huron is also great. Yes, lots of good seeds, and he has a lot of good content on YouTube. Disinfecting pots. I have never put them in the dishwasher just because of the volume that we do. So what we'll do is we fill I think it's like a 50-gallon tub with the like designated amount of bleach and water, and we soak them for 15 minutes, and then we pull them out, we let them dry, and then we put them away. I've also seen people just like really tap them, like get all the dirt out and let them sit in the sun. I think a dishwasher could work quite well. My only concern is often they have a lot of soil residue left in them that then could potentially clog your dishwasher. Okay, good. I answered that question. All right. I think I answered everyone's questions.
Thank you so much, Darby. That was so informative, and you really just made it so easy to understand. And I definitely learned a lot, even as somebody who has done seed starting, a couple years now in a row for my home garden.
Good. I'm glad to hear it.
Yes. Lots of things coming in.
Well, I was happy to spend my Monday night with all of you. I had a fun.
Well, thank you all again for attending. I see you're getting some applause on video too. We really appreciate you spending your Monday night with us as well. And like I said, we do have a seed library here at the Royal Oak Public Library. I will send out a link to the form if you guys would like to fill out a request to pick up some seeds here. You're also welcome to just pop in anytime and check out our seed library. And we will post the recording of this on YouTube in the next day or two. And if you'd like to rewatch it again, just to maybe rehash everything, feel free to do that. At any rate, I guess we can go ahead and say goodnight. And again, thank you so much, Darby.
You're welcome. Thank you.
All right, good night, everybody.